Hello everyone, this is my video demonstration for task 6.1 Authentication and Authorization. Let's look at the code first. First we import the required headers and libraries. After that in this line public class basic authentication handler. This line defines a public class named basic authentication handler. This class inherits from authentication handler class. It is a base class provided by ASP.NET Core for handling authentication schemes. Next, we move to these lines. These lines define the constructor of basic authentication handler class. The private read-only, this line right here, line number 20. This line declares a private read-only field named underscore password hasher. This field will hold an instance of the interface iPasswordHasher used for hashing and verifying passwords. The constructor takes several arguments used for configuration and initialization, such as option, logger, encoder, and clock. The option is used to access the authentication scheme. The logger is used to create and manage logging providers for recording events. The encoder here is interface for encoding and decoding URL strings. The clock here provides access to system clock for retrieving current date and time. Base, this line calls the constructor of the base class authentication handler and passes the received arguments for initialization. This line number 30. Finally, this line creates a new instance of password hasher and assigns it to the password hasher field. This instance will be used for password hashing verification. Next, this line number 33, it defines an asynchronous method named handle authenticate async. This method is inherited from the base class and is responsible for handling the authentication process. It is marked as protected override because it's an implementation of a method defined in the base class, but with specific behavior for this handler. Next, this line number 36 and 37. These lines check if the request header contains an authorization header with the basic scheme. This line, this part checks if the basic key exists in the request header. Next, if the header is missing, www authenticate header is added to response with a realm message indicating access requires basic authentication and the specific realm access to the robot controller. Next we have these lines, line 40 to 44. These lines extract and validate the authorization header. These lines retrieves the value. Line number 41, it checks if the auth header is either null or empty using string.is null or empty, or if it doesn't start with basic. If the header is missing, invalid, or doesn't use basic scheme, the method returns authenticate result.fail, indicating authentication failure. Next, the lines 47 to 49. These lines decode the credential from authorization header. Substring basic length trim. This part extracts the encoded credentials portion by removing basic from the beginning and trimming any white spaces. Next, the line encoding UTF decodes the base 64 encoded credentials back into a plain text string using UTF-8 encoding. The split function decodes credential strings at the first colon Assuming the format is username semicolon password. This results in an array named parts where part 0 will contain the username and part 1 will contain the password. Next, the lines 57 to 61. First, the line 67 retrieves the user information from a data persistence layer using a function defined in Robot Controller API. Next, if user is not found, the method returns authenticate result.fail, indicating authentication failure. Next, the lines 66 to 69. These lines use the bcrypt.net library for password verification. First, the if condition verifies the provided password against the user's hashed password stored in user.passwordhash using bcrypt.verify function from the library. If password verification fails, the method returns authentication result.fail, indicating authentication failure. Next, the lines 77 to the line number 83. This line creates a new claims identity object named identity. A claims identity represents a user's identity and contains a collection of claims. Here the claims array created earlier is used and scheme.name is used as identifier. Next, the lines 84 and 85. These lines create an authentication ticket. First, the where principal. This line creates a claims principal object named principal. A claims principal represents the authenticated user and wraps the claims identity object for security purposes. Next, a ticket. This line creates an authentication ticket named object named ticket. This ticket holds information about the authenticated user and is used by ASP.NET Core Framework to manage authentication state. Next, at last, this line results this line returns the final result of authentication process. It returns authentication result.success, indicating successful authentication and providing the ticket object that contains the user's claims and authentication information. This is all for basic authentication handler.cs file. Now let's look at the code for user data access file. This code defines a class named user-data-access in robot controller API.persistence. This class provides a functionality to interact with user data using PostgreSQL database. Let's look at the code now. First, we have the connection string. This line defines a private constant string named connection string. It holds the connection details for the PostgreSQL database, including server hostname, username, password, and database name. Next, we have a first method that is getAllUsers. This method retrieves all users from users table. First, this line defines a public static method named getAllUsers that returns a list of user model objects. Next, the method creates a new empty list of user models. The next line, line number 12, it establishes a connection to the database using the connection string. The connection is opened and a npgsql command object cmd is created with a SQL query to select all columns from user table. This command is executed using executeReader, which retrieves results as a data reader using var dr is equal to cmd.executeReader function. Next, a loop iterates through each row in the data reader. Inside the loop, a new user model object is created. by reading each column's value and casting it to the appropriate type. The DB null check handles cases where a column value might be null in the database. After processing all rows, the list of user models object is returned. Next is the method of getUserByRole. This line defines a public static method named getUsersByRole that takes a string argument role and returns a list of user model objects. Similar to getAllUsers, it creates a user list, establishes a connection, opens it, and creates an npgsql command object. The query here selects all columns from users where the role column matches the provided role. A parameter named role is added to the command to prevent SQL injection vulnerabilities. The data reader (dr) is used to iterate and populate user model objects as in getAllUsers. Finally, a list of users matching the role is returned. Next, we have the getUserById. This method retrieves a user by using its ID. This line defines a public static method named getUserById that takes an integer argument ID and returns a user model object, or it returns a null if nothing is found. First, it establishes a connection, opens it, and creates a command object. The query here selects all columns from users where the ID column matches the provided ID. A parameter named ID is added to the command. The data reader is used. If a row is found, a new user model object is created and returned. If no row is found, the method returns null. Next is the getUserByEmail. This method retrieves users by their email address. This first line, line number 86, this defines a public static method named getUserByEmail that takes a string argument email and returns a user model object, or it returns a null if not found. Similar to getUserById, it establishes a connection, opens it, creates a command object with a query, selecting all columns from users where email column matches the provided email. A parameter named email is added to the command. If a row is found, a new user model object is created and returned. If no row is found, the method returns null. Next, we have create user. This method creates a new user in the database. Public static bool create user, user model user. This line defines a public static method named createUser that takes a user model object as input and returns a bool indicating success or failure. It establishes a connection, opens it, and creates a command object. The query is an insert statement targeting the users table with columns matching the user model properties. The user object properties are used to set the parameter values. The description and role properties are handled with null check, user description, and this is an operator that is used to insert null if they are null in user model object. Then there is functionality execute non-query. This executes the query and returns the number of affected rows. The method returns true if at least one row is affected, indicating successful insertion, otherwise it returns false. Next, we have the update user. This method updates an existing user in the database. This line defines a public static method named updateUser that takes an integer ID and a user model object with updated properties and returns a bool indicating success or failure. Similar to the above functionalities, it first establishes a connection, opens it, and creates a command object. The query is an updated statement targeting the user's table, updating specific columns, first name, last name, etc., based on the provided ID. Parameters are used for each updated value. Similar to create user, the updated user object properties are used to set the parameter values. The description and role properties are handled with null check, and the execute non-query executes the query and returns the number of affected rows, as previously explained. The method returns true if at least one row is affected, indicating successful update, otherwise it returns false. Next we have the delete user. This method deletes a user from the database. It defines a public static method named delete user that takes integer ID and returns a bool indicating success or failure. It, similar to the above, it establishes a connection and opens it and creates a command object. The query is delete statement targeting the user's table where ID column matches the provided ID. A parameter named ID is added to the command. Execute non-query, as explained previously, returns the number of affected row and returns true, otherwise will return false. Next, we have update user credentials. This method is used to update a user's email ID and password. This line defines a public static method named update user credentials that takes an integer ID, a string email, and a string password and returns a bool indicating success or failure. The query is a patch statement targeting the user's table, updating only the email and password hash column based on provided ID. Parameters are used for each updated value. The email and password arguments are used to set the corresponding parameters. Execute non-query function is used to return the affected rows. And this is all for user data access. Now let's move to the code of usercontroller.cs file. First, we have API controller. This attribute indicates that the class is a web API controller. Next, the route. This attribute defines the root prefix for all controller methods, which is API user in this case. Next, this line number 13, declares a public class named controller that inherits from the controller base class provided by ASP.NET Core MVC. Next, we have private read-only iPassword hasher. This line declares a private read-only field named pwd hasher of type iPassword hasher. This field will be injected during dependency injection to handle password hashing. Next, we have public user controller. This line defines the constructor of the controller class. It takes an argument of type iPassword hasher and assigns it to the pw hasher field. This constructor is called during the controller instance. This constructor is called during the controller process to receive the password hashing services. Next, we have getAllUsers. This attribute specifies the HTTP method for the section, which is get. The attribute indicates a successful response with a status code 200 OK will contain a list of user model objects. The next line 24, this attribute indicates an unsuccessful response with status code 404 not found will be returned if no users are found. The uh, the line number 25. This line defines a public method named getAllUsers that returns an iAction result. This method is responsible for retrieving all users. It calls user.data_access.getAllUsers to retrieve a list of user model objects from the data persistence layer. If the list is empty, it returns a not found object with a message indicating no users were found. Otherwise, it returns an OK object with the list of user models object. Next, we have getUserById. This attribute specifies a HTTP GET method and indicates a route parameter named ID. Similar to getAllUsers, it has response type annotations for success 200 and not found 404. The line 38 defines a public method named getUserById that takes an integer argument ID and returns IActionResult. This method is responsible for retrieving a user by their ID. It calls user.data_access.getUserByTheID to retrieve a user model object based on the provided ID. If user is null, not found, it returns a not found object with the message indicating the user with the ID wasn't found. Otherwise, it returns an OK object with the retrieved user model object. Next, we have getUserByAdmin. This attribute specifies a getHTTP method for route API users admin. Similar to previous methods, it has response types for success 200 and not found 404. This line number 51, it defines a public method named getUsersByAdmin that returns a iAction result. This method seems specific to the context of application and might be retrieving users with specific roles admin in this case. It calls user.data_access get users role admin to retrieve a list of users based on the role admin. If the list is empty, it returns a not found object with a message indicating no users with admin role were found. Otherwise, it assumes there's only one admin user and returns an OK object with the first user in the list. Next, we have createUser. This attribute specifies the HTTP method for the section which is post. This attribute 201 line number 62 indicates a successful response with status code 201 created will be returned when a new user is created. Response code 400 indicates an unsuccessful response. Bad request will be returned for invalid input. This line 64 indicates this line defines a public method named createUser that takes user model, new user argument, and returns an iAction result. This method is responsible for creating a new user. It checks if new user is null. If so, it returns a bad request object with the message indicating the user model cannot be null. It uses bcrypt.net to hash the password provided in the new user.passwordHash property. Next is the line userdata.createUser. It calls this to persist the new user information in the database. It checks the return value from user.data_access.createUser. If creation fails, it returns a bad request object with the message indicating the new user creation failed. On successful creation, it returns a created at action object. This creates a response with the status code of 201 created and includes a location header pointing to newly created user details accessible through getUserById method with the new user's ID. Next, we have the updateUser. This attribute specifies the HTTP method for this action which is put. Here, the status code 200 indicates successful and status code 400 indicates not found request. The line 89 defines a public method named updateUser that takes an integer ID and user model updated user argument and returns an iAction result. This method is responsible for updating an existing user. It calls the update user to update the information in the database based on the provided ID and new user details in updated user. It checks the return value from user.data_access.updated_user. If the update fails, it returns not found object with a message indicating the user with the provided ID was not found. On successful update, it returns an OK object with the updated user object containing the updated information. Next, we have the delete user. It This attribute specifies the HTTP method uh, for the action which is delete. This attribute indicates a successful response with status code 204 no content will be returned when a user is deleted. This line number 104, defines a public method named deleteUser that indicates an integer ID argument and returns an iAction result. This method is responsible for deleting a user. It calls user.data_access.deleteUser to delete the user from database based on the provided ID. It checks the return value from the function. If the deletion fails, it returns a not found object with message indicating the user with provided ID wasn't found. On successful deletion, it returns a no content object with an empty body indicating the resource was deleted. Next, we have the update user credentials. This attribute specifies the HTTP method for this action, which is patch. Patch is often used for partial updates. It has a response of 200, a response of 400 bad request, and a response of 404 not found. This line defines a public method named updateUserCredentials that takes an int ID and login model updated user credentials argument and returns an iAction result. It retrieves the user ID by using user.data_access.getUserById. If the user is not found, it returns a not found object with message indicating that user was not found. It updates the retrieved user's email with the value from updated user credentials.email. It hashes the password provided in the user credentials using updated user credentials.password using bcrypt.net. It updates the user password using newly generated hash. It calls user.data_access.updateCredentials to persist the updated email and password hash in the database. It checks the return value from user.data_access update user credentials. If the update fails, it returns a not found object with a message indicating the user with the provided ID wasn't found. On successful update, it returns OK object with the message indicating the user credentials was updated successfully. This is all for usercontrollers.cs file. This is the code for program.cs file. First, this line 12, creates a web builder application using the object builder that is used to configure the application. Next, we have services registration. First, the line add controller adds services for controllers API endpoints to the dependency injection container. This line configures the authorization policies. The line admin only, line number 18, defines a policy named admin only that requires user to have the claim role with the value admin. Next, there is users only that requires users to have claim with the value users. Next, the line number 24. This line registers the password hasher user model class with a scoped lifetime to handle password hashing for user model objects. The line 27 here adds an authentication scheme named basic authentication that uses my custom basic authentication handler class for handling the authentication. The line number 50, this line builds the application based on the configuration in the builder. And at last, the app.run starts the application and listens for the incoming requests. Thank you. Now let's look at the output of this task. First, we have the basic commands. This is the get command for robot. This command gets all the move commands. Next, we have the read commands using its ID. Okay, so command isn't available. As you can see, the 11 number ID command is available. Next, we can add a new command using the post functionality. Next, we can delete any command using the given ID. Let's delete a command. As you can see, the command has been deleted successfully. Delete command. Command has been deleted successfully. Similarly, we can read the maps that are already created, and we can get square maps and read the map using the ID that we provide. And we can update a map or post a new map or even delete a map. This endpoint get map by coordinates is used to check whether a particular map has the given coordinates in it or not. Next, let's get to the user commands that were particular to this task. First, this command is used to get all the users that have the admin rules. Let's see. So these are all the users that have admin role in them. There are multiple users. All users have admin role. Next, we can get all the users with and without the admin roles. Let's run. So now we have all the users. See the ID number 15. This user does not have the admin role but is displayed using this command. Next, we can get a user by its ID. Let's send here the ID 16. Here we can see that we receive the user with the ID number 16. Next, we can add a new user as we want. Let's change the name here. And give the role user and the password as password and send it. Here we can see that a new user has been created. When we do get all users, here you can see that a new user has been created that we just put the parameters of. Next, we can change the user details. The ID was 28. Let's here we can see the user we just created, the user number 28. We can update it using the put command. See, the user has been updated with the success code of 200. Next, we can also delete the user that we have created using the delete command here. Let's put the ID 28. See, the user has been deleted successfully. Let's get all the users to verify that if this user has been deleted or not. As you can see, the user is no longer here. The user number 28 is gone. Patch command is used to update the email ID and the password, particularly for any available user. Let's change to user number 16 and we send it. Here you can see the user credentials have been updated successfully. The password present here, this password is saved in the database using the bcrypt. It is not saved in plain text for security purposes. Next we have authorization. So to check it, let's get to all users back. Here we can see that this person is an admin. Okay, so let's use his ID and try to access square maps. Here we go to authorization, basic authorization, and put the ID that we just copied. If we give some other password, it will say this is unauthorized because it is not the correct password for this email ID. But if we try to give the correct password and the correct email ID, you can see that we can access all the data. And if we try to change the email ID, we will not be able to access the data. So this is all about the output, and thank you.